peoples. So what I'm here today to talk about is Rails 3. I'm going to be pretty technical, so I'm talking about sort of the plan for Rails 3. So Rails 3 is, while we're on the Mac angle, Rails 3 is like the snow leopard of Rails. A lot of effort was put into improve the internals. There's definitely some cool features, but a lot of the work that was done was about making Rails itself more solid for the future. So what I'm going to talk about today is mostly that sort of thing, with some discussion about what the cool features are, and obviously take any questions afterwards. I'll go through who I am real quick. I'm Yehuda. I'm Katz on GitHub, Twitter, Gmail, everything. I work for EngineYard, which does both deployment services and open source. I'm obviously on the open source side of the business. Other open source stuff we do is Rubinius, JRuby, Rails, and then a bunch of stuff relating to deployment. For about a year, I worked for EngineYard on the merb project. The merb project was originally started as an auxiliary project for Rails to handle some performance-sensitive parts of your application, originally specifically for file upload. So at the time that merb was created, the Rails was unable to handle certain types of things like thread safe, basically any case where you needed to be able to handle a lot of things that were long but did not take a lot of CPU. So file uploads are a case where you can just sit there pretty much idle, but there's a lot of I/O, and if you have to block waiting for the entire file to finish uploading, you're basically stuck. So merb was originally created to alleviate that problem. Since then, that problem has been better solved by Nginx's own modules. But merb eventually evolved to be sort of a full-fledged replacement to Rails by looking at the things that Rails wasn't so good at, which was mostly internal architecture. So merb was sort of a rethink of the internals without radically departing from the concepts. And that was actually what made merb really successful, I think. I think Rails has something going for it. And I think that all the other frameworks, the smaller ones like Sinatra and Camping and I guess Rango now, the thing that they fail at is, and they're very good for their own right, but the reason why they're not radically successful in the large scale is because they're trying to come up with a new idea. And merb fundamentally didn't really try to come up with a new idea. It said, like, Rails' ideas are mostly correct, with a few tweaks for the end user, like you should be able to make more choices than Rails lets you make, and a lot of internal differences. So actually, it turned out that our strong feelings about these things did not conflict with Rails' strong feelings, because they were mostly orthogonal concerns. The Rails core team cared a lot about conventions, which we actually also cared about, but not very much about internals at the time. We cared a lot about internals, agreed pretty much about conventions. So it wasn't that big of a stretch. It seemed like a big stretch at the time, but it wasn't that big of a stretch to combine efforts and work on improving the internals of Rails through the work and thinking that we did on merb. I work with a gentleman named Carl Lurch. That is our icon. We have accounts on GitHub, Twitter. You can go carlhuda at engineer.com. You can go into the Carl Huda channel on Freenode. And yeah, that's basically our deal. This is our icon, and we pair a lot, and it turned out to be really good. I would say the biggest thing that pairing has helped us do is avoid heading down crazy rat holes. So, for instance, I will not go down a 2-week crazy thing, and he won't go down a 2-week crazy thing because the other one will be there to say that's a bad idea. It's very easy when you're working on a project for that to happen. And so I would say that while there's definitely productivity improvements even in just pairing, probably the biggest productivity improvement comes from not having spent a lot of time doing stupid things. And if you think you're too smart to do stupid things, I want to hire you, I guess. And also, it's probably not true in practice. EngineYard Cloud is a product that EngineYard does, and EngineYard Cloud is very different from 37 Signals applications. So getting a product that's not 37 Signals like fully represented on the core team has actually turned out to be very good. I obviously worked on projects that were different before I came to work for EngineYard, and Cloud continues that spirit. It makes it very easy for me to see what the requirements are when they're not just the same basic thing that all the Rails apps do. So getting that momentum into Rails basically has let us take a fairly stagnant product, because Rails has historically been very good at doing the sorts of things that you want, that a company like 37 Signals would want. That was really pretty much done, I think. I think Rails pretty much solved that problem. There were still some enhancements that we could do, but it's pretty much licked. And the next frontier is really looking at problems that aren't exactly like that. So different problems, and getting a representation from that sort of thing has been helpful, I think. So on to big sorts of things that we've done in Rails 3. The first big feature is just making it easier to opt in and opt out of things. An example of this is active support. So can you sort of see that? Cool. So here's active support conversions, and you can see that there's an array module in there that has a 2-sentence method, and in there it does assert valid keys, right? And the problem is that assert valid keys, where does that come from? It comes from another part of active support. So if you actually want to require this 2-sentence method on array, which you might want to do randomly as a separate gem, you have to go figure out where assert valid keys is and a bunch of other stuff, right? So that's an example. But you have to go find all the things that are defined, that are used here but not defined, and then go hunt those down and then further track it down. And then you might get a list of all the files you have to require, and then you can do that. And usually that would work, but almost nobody's willing to do that, right? It basically means being a human compiler, going through all the things, finding all the methods that look like they're not in the core library, and then hunting down where those actually came from in active support. The equivalent file in Rails 3 looks like this. For one thing, we're reopening array, which is, I think, makes it easier to understand what's going on. But the important part is that we're actually requiring the file, right? So we're requiring active support corex #/keys. And what you can see here is that this is not a fundamentally radical architectural departure from Rails 2. It's just doing something that is kind of difficult for you to do yourself, but it radically changes what you can do with active support. Because now it is actually reasonable for you to require conversions.rb on your own without having to have any worries. If, in fact, we have encountered occasionally, so we did a big job to go through the entire active support and find all these dependencies. There are probably once a month now a case where we made a mistake and missed it, but that's a bug now, right? So if you try to require a single active support file and it doesn't work because there's a missing method, that's actually a bug, and we'll go fix that. So we're supposed to declare all the dependencies, and I'm actually working on a separate project to do some crazy, essentially metaprogramming to figure out what the dependencies are by running our unit tests and seeing if we made any mistakes. So hopefully long term we'll get it 100%, but we can probably get really, really close to that just by doing it manually, and that's really good. Even better than just doing this in active support is that Action Controller itself has started to put in these dependencies. So the logger, for instance, declares a dependency in active support logger and active support benchmarkable, and that's just part of a general desire to allow you to use whatever parts of Rails you want. Some of the parts don't necessarily make sense to use just on their own. You may need a few components together, but if you just find the top-level components that you need, you're always able to require those without having to worry that there are other dependencies on parts of Rails that are there. In some cases, this was simply a matter of declaring dependencies. In other cases, it was a matter of rethinking sort of how the dependency graph looked, because it may have been too crazy for it to be reasonable. But just doing this effort of, we would like you to be able to require whatever files you want as much as possible, has led to a much saner internal infrastructure. A related concept to opting in and opting out is just general modularity. And if you go into Action Controller in Rails 2.3 and do ls, you get this, which is a pretty big list. And there's some things here that are pretty reasonable, like you expect to see base.rb in the Action Controller directory. You don't expect to see cgix.rb or middlewares.rb in the controller directory because it's nothing to do with controllers. It's actually a different concept. If you go to Action Mailer base.rb, you see that there's some hacks that have to be done to try to track down if you were in Action Controller, then include these other things, because Action Mailer wants to provide layouts, but you may have required Action Mailer as its own component, and there's no notion of dependencies. So you can see that there's this sort of conceptual idea that maybe somebody might want to use Action Mailer on its own, but that you have to know that if you don't use Action Controller, that you're not going to get these other features. There's no actual way of doing it, and that's because the Action Controller was treated as this huge granular requirement. Like, you either had Action Controller or you didn't have it. And if you didn't have it, you couldn't get these other features. Helpers.rb, I'm not going to even show you. It's basically just a copy of the Action Controller helpers code with a few modifications because some of the variable names are different in Action Mailer. It's just a bad situation. So if you look at Action Controller 2.3, it looks like one big glob. There's that huge directory with like 1 million files. But it actually turns out that it breaks down into 3 pieces. There's the dispatcher part, which actually you might want to use on your own, completely separate from Rails. So this is just a set of rack extensions. Raise your hand if you know what rack is. Sweet. So the dispatcher is just a set of rack extensions. It has a more advanced request and response method, a bunch of middlewares. And you can use that as sort of a rack ext if you would want to. Totally, it works fine and has no dependencies on other parts of Rails. Then there's the generic controller. Those are the things that we might want to use in ActionMailer. Things like layouts, helpers, general templating, right? Those are things that are controller-ish, that are related to being in a controller, but have nothing to do with requests and responses. And finally, on top of that, there's the notion of the rack part of the controller. There's the action controller base. There's if you actually render this template, we want to set a status code and a content type, right? So there's that extra piece. And in Rails 3, that breaks down into action dispatch, new top-level component, action controller, and then the generic controller pieces are in a new top-level component called abstract controller. So we've essentially broken this up into a few pieces. If you go into the action controller directory now, it's a lot saner. There's still some things like deprecated in here that need to be removed and legacy. The dispatch directory is eventually going to be completely moved into action dispatch. The reason why that's still there is that there are still people who rely on constants like action controller dispatch. So that directory is just there to shim old code that may rely on old constants. But more importantly, if you go into the action dispatch directory, there's some stuff in there. There's the HTTP stuff, which is a request and response object, middlewares, the routers in there, and additional testing components, which you can use, again, for your own rack projects. It's just some extra, provides Rails integration helpers, essentially, for any rack project. An abstract controller is, again, the top-level components, callbacks, exceptions, helpers, layouts, rendering. And these are the components that work for ActionMailer as well. If you go back into ActionMailer now, you can see that there's a much more clear conception of what's going on here, right? There is this notion of abstract controller. So now we don't have to check to see if you have action controller. ActionMailer now depends on abstract controller conceptually. And things like rendering, layouts, and helpers, they're not copied into ActionMailer or conditionally depended on. They're always there. They're always part of ActionMailer without you having to worry that you now pulled in a huge amount of code from action controller. What this means is that you can conceptually do require action dispatch or require abstract controller or require action controller at whatever level of granularity you find meaningful for your project. A harder problem when you're dealing with all this is just general dependencies between code. So dependencies between files is pretty easy. There's another dependencies problem, and I will illustrate it as thus. So here's action controller base.rb in Rails 2.3, just the render method. Right? So this is just the render method in Rails 2.3. And inside of that method, there's a lot of things. One of the things is layout equals pick layout options. So the base.rb file inside of the code says layout equals pick layout options. And that essentially means that there is conceptually a dependency between the base.rb code and the layouts modules. Even though the layouts module tries to be a separate component, it turns out that it is dependent on. You could, if you try really hard, try to avoid using the layouts module. If you patch Rails, there was some post about this. You could patch Rails to remove the includes. But if you ran into this branch where the layout was trying to be picked, you would end up being forced to use it anyway. And that would raise an exception if you didn't have the layouts module. So there's basically a whole bunch of stuff you have to know in order to try to break apart Rails, which can't be done without patching Rails anyway. But if you would want to conceptually, that's how it works. And pick layout is in a separate file. Like I said, the action controller layouts.rb is a separate file that has pick layout in it. So that means that even though if you look at it, it seems like it's separate. It uses the keyword module. It seems like it might be modular. And there's another file called base. It turns out that they're actually very tightly coupled together, and they basically are just one thing, which is base. Right? So it's base spread out across a bunch of files, organized using modules in Ruby. But it's not actually providing any modularity. The way this works in Rails 3 is that there's two separate components, the layouts component and the rendering component. The layouts component depends on the rendering component. And if you actually just require the layouts component without the rendering component, it knows to pull in the rendering component. So essentially, we have a well-declared set of dependencies where things know if you use this component, pull in that one. You, the user, don't have to really know how the dependency graph works. You just include whatever top-level features you want, and that's fine. In the case of layouts and rendering, it's pretty obvious. Like if you want layouts, you need rendering, although it's still nice that you don't have to remember that. There are more complex cases like Flash Notice requires sessions. Again, you might have figured that out, but you might not have, and you don't want to be experiencing weird bugs where you pulled in Flash and it's just not working for some reason, right? You want that to actually work. So the render method in Rails 3 looks like this. It's normalizing the options and calling super. So this is on base.rb. Normalize options does a bunch of stuff, but it's pretty easy. It's all in one place. It's doing stuff like if you just specify a string, it checks to see if there's a slash in it. If there's a slash, then it's file. If there's a slash at the beginning, it's a file. If there's a slash in the middle, it's a template. Otherwise, it's an action, right? So things that work in Rails 2.3 now placed in its own normalization method. And then if you go into the rendering controller module itself, again, it just calls super, and it sets the content type to be equal to the MIME type of the template that was actually rendered. So the rendering controller in Metal layers on additional functionality to the abstract version of rendering to say, set the content type equal to the correct MIME type. If you go into the layouts module, the way that this is done, the way that this works is that there's a new module called active support concern, which you could extend onto any module. So you extend active support concern. And then you can do stuff like include action controller, rendering controller. And that means once you've extended the concern module, that means if you include me, make sure that rendering controller is included first. And what that means is that super will go from me, guaranteed it will get to rendering controller eventually. So it's basically saying, I'm expecting to be able to super to rendering controller, and I'm expecting that I can do stuff before and after that to affect the other behavior. Okay, so that's modularity and opting in and opting out. Performance is a big deal. This is something that we cared about a lot in merb, and Rails has notoriously had some performance issues, especially with regard to very, very small actions. So where your entire action is pulling something from a cache and returning it right away, or just pulling something from the database and rendering it as JSON. These things have very low your app overhead, and so the Rails overhead starts to matter a lot. And so when you look at the overhead of things like just rendering a string and an index, rendering a simple template, a partial or a number of partials, you can see that we've made a significant difference in the overhead. Again, in this case, it goes from something like 1.5 milliseconds on the right end to 210 microseconds. So basically, we've made the overhead go from somewhat noticeable if you're doing a small action to basically zero. And in terms of times faster, it's a significant amount. But again, this is overhead. A measure of overhead. If your own application is taking time, we're not doing anything about that in this case. In the case of a large number of partials, it starts to matter more. So in the case of rendering 100 partials, we go down from 9 milliseconds to 2.5. Collections are even a bigger deal. We go down from 8 milliseconds. So basically, a collection of 100 was about the same as just rendering 100 partials in Rails 2.3. You didn't see any big win out of the fact that you declared the collection. In Rails 3, it's down to less than 1 millisecond to render a collection of 100 simple partials.
That would be Ruby 1.8?
This is Ruby 1.9. So for performance, we've been heavily focusing on Ruby 1.9. There are gains in Ruby 1.8 as well, but the gains in Ruby 1.9 are more noticeable, and we think that people who are very heavily focused on performance will be using Ruby 1.9. If you actually compare 1.8 and 2.3 to 1.9 and 3.0, there's like orders of magnitude difference in some cases. Like in these cases, Ruby 1.8 might have been taking like 50 milliseconds or more. So basically, we've optimized heavily for 1.9, and we've also optimized heavily for 3.0. And so you could see like pretty significant benefits in overhead, especially if you're doing stuff like rendering a lot of partials and collections, and you've noticed that has produced some performance overhead for you. I know like a lot of people have complained that when they render large collections, that they notice that it's faster to not render partials, right? To just do a loop and put the partial data inside the template. And that should no longer really be the case in Rails 3. So it's significantly faster. How does that work exactly? So here's the Rails 2.3 partial code, and you can see that inside of the loop, so a collection is obviously a loop somewhere, right? And you can see that inside the loop, there's a lot of things that happen multiple times, like the partial template is picked a bunch of times, 100 times, right? And even though you've said you want to render this partial with this name 100 times, you don't actually have to look that up 100 times, but it's being looked up 100 times. It's looking up what the counter name is. So if you render a partial called post, it has a local variable called post counter, post counter, and it's determining that 100 times. It's not very expensive, but it's still doing a method call 100 times. And then it also is duplicating the local assigns 100 times. So there's more things here, but that's the big deal. That's the big issue. The same code in Rails 3 looks like this. So we've pulled most of the work out of the loop. So now we're just setting the counter name, which we've already determined, setting the as. So if you said like as my name, then we set that. And then we just do the render a bunch of times. We've already duplicated the local variables and push it into segments. This is actually pretty significant, and essentially what we had to do in order to make this work is that there's another case of partials where you don't know the templates in advance. So where you said render this collection, and it could have like posts and events and a bunch of other stuff in the collection. If you don't specify the template, we go down a slower path, which is still faster than Rails 2.3's path, general path, but it's slower than this. This is a case where we say, you told us a template, so we're not going to bother to look it up or try to figure it out for every single one. So there is a case where we have to find out every single time, and that's definitely slower. It's still, again, noticeably faster than 2.3, but we're able to optimize cases where you did give us the information that we need. Agnosticism is the next huge story of Rails 3. So the biggest one that we've talked about a lot is active model was originally called, it was called Active ORM, and now it's folded into the active model project. Essentially what we've done here is there's a bunch of code in Rails that assumes active record. We've just gone through the entire code base, cataloged what those things are. So we made a list. It's a few methods. It's like valid question mark, new record question mark, and then there's some names that you have to be able to get out of it. So like when you say render a partial with this object, it goes and figures out what the name of the partial should be from the object. So there's some names that you have to specify, but we've essentially said here are the things you need. It's documented on the wiki, and there's a test for it in Rails that you can use. It's active model lint dot test, I think, and you pass in an object, and it will tell you what things are missing. So whether or not it complies with the API and what's missing. And all we do is inside of our code, we check to see if your object responds to toModel. If so, we call it, giving you a ability to hand back a valid proxy or a valid object that matches. Otherwise, we just use the object itself. So here's an example. Here's form 4. And you can see that in the middle of form 4, we say object equals convert to model object. So if you say form 4, some data mapper object, some SQL object, one of your own objects, right? That'll work as long as you have a toModel method on your object that returns a valid object, a valid active model object, and you return it. How that actually works in practice, so for instance, data mapper has decided that they're just going to make their own objects compliant with this API. It doesn't mean that their entire API looks like active record. It means that valid question mark, dot errors, these things look like active records. So they've decided they're just going to make their objects look like active records objects for these things. And so in that case, you just return self from toModel, and then we'll just use that. And that's basically your way of saying this would have worked before, right? This would have worked fine in Rails 2.3. And then SQL model, they actually are using an errors object that does not look like Rails' error object. So they create a proxy object that just returns, in which they pass in self, and it just returns, it converts the SQL version to an active record pleasant version. Okay. The last piece for ORM agnosticism is generators. So you can specify that for your generators are ORM, your template engine is Haml, test framework is RSpec, and that just means that when it goes to generate an application or a resource, instead of just saying, oh, here, I'm going to dump in the active record stuff, it gives any plugin an opportunity to register additional generators for that thing that you're generating for your ORM or for your template engine. JavaScript. So here's an example, link to remote. Link to remote looks like this. You can say link to remote, you provide URL and status codes, and then you say like what JavaScript should run in that case. The output looks like this. You can see that the link actually doesn't have an href, so if you don't have JavaScript on, it just doesn't do anything at all. And then the onClick equals is a bunch of actual JavaScript code, so you have to have new ajax.request. You'd be using jQuery, it just doesn't work. The Rails 3 API is basically the same thing, except it eliminates the additional on 404 stuff, and it emits this markup. So it emits a valid href, and then it says the JS type is remote. So it's a valid link that would work without JavaScript. And then here's how jQuery would do it. Get all the data.js type equals remotes, bind a click event to that says $.get this.href. This is a simplified example. If you want, we would want to support more things like updating and all that, so it would probably have more code than this, but this is essentially the strategy, right? Emit markup, jQuery reads the markup, Dojo reads the markup, Prototype reads the markup, but the Rails itself no longer cares what the JavaScript is doing. It's just saying, like, we have provided an API. It's this markup. JavaScript, do what you want. Additionally, we can now have the libraries themselves could use their own internal eventing system to trigger new events. So, for instance, the jQuery version could trigger a remote success.rails event, and then you, as in your application.js, could bind to that event and do your own stuff. So instead of having to go in and hack in, on success, I want this, you can just say, like, for this special link, when I get the remote success event, this is what I want to do. So you can do that in your application.js, even though we have our own JavaScript file that's handling the nitty-gritty that was otherwise being emitted by Rails itself. This is really nice for other libraries. So for jQuery, for Dojo, pretty much all the big libraries have their own, like there's derails and jrails. So it's nice for these guys. They basically get to write JavaScript, which they're good at, right? So essentially this means that the Ruby guys can write Ruby code, which we're good at, and the JavaScript guys can write JavaScript, which they're good at. And we only have to talk through the common information, which is the markup. We both know how to emit markup. They know how to consume markup. That's a good deal. It also lets you do homegrown stuff. So if you want to build your own library, if you don't like the jQuery Rails plugin, you can easily build your own without having to go throw away all the work you've already done. And it, in general, reduces friction. So there's a problem right now where if you start using Rails and you've used the prototype helpers for a while, if you want to switch to jQuery or something else, you have to actually spend some time thinking about it, which means that most people, when they start projects, they have to think about what JavaScript library they want to use merely because they can't use the helpers. This lets you use the helpers right away without having to think about the repercussions. And then when you decide, oh, I don't actually want to use prototype, prototype sucks, I want to use jQuery, obviously. When you do that, you can just remove prototype.rails.js and replace it with jQuery.rails.js, and it will just continue to work, right? Because we're going to continue emitting the same markup we ever did, and we're just going to use a different library to consume it. Obviously, any custom code you've written that used prototype would have to change, but you don't have to change any of the code in the Ruby side of your framework, which is nice. And it makes it pretty clear where the code is, right? There's going to be an application.js which has the code that has to be ported. There's also a lot of new features, again, in Apple's parlance. There's a lot of new features. You're probably not going to find all the new features if you go read all the code. But there's a bunch of features that are hugely important and worth highlighting. The first really big new feature is Bundler. This is how it worked in Rails 2.3. This suffered from a pretty fatal flaw, which is that you had to have the dependencies in order to install them. So that actually is true about Rails 2.3. In order to install gems, you have to have them. And that's because when you run the thing to install your gems, it basically boots up your environment and then asks, oh, what gems did you boot up? And the only way to actually get through to the end of booting up your environment is to have all the dependencies for your application, right? So you can't actually do it. It's the massive mega flaw in the whole system. So the solution is to not do it inside of the part of Rails that boots up, put it somewhere else, which is a gem file. And gem file is part of the bundler, which is a non-Rails specific project that is already being used by a bunch of non-Rails and Rails projects. So it's not coupled to Rails, but it enables normal Rails usage. So here's an example. This is GemCutter. GemCutter is an open source Rails app which you should check out and contribute to. And they basically are using Rails 2.3, so they can't use vendor gems because that has special irrevocable meaning in Rails 2.3, so they use vendor bundler gems, and you can do that. And you can also specify what gem sources you need, and you can specify what gems you need, what versions. You can specify either hard versions or soft versions. They're not using this feature, but you can also specify a Git repo or a file path, and if it finds a gem spec in that Git repo, it will use that gem spec as though it was an actual gem. Otherwise, you can tell it the version that you mean for it to be. So you can say, the gem rack mount 1.0.1 is actually located at this Git repo, and it will just pull it in as though it was a regular gem and treat it as though it was a regular gem for dependency resolution. And that's the other big story here, is that we actually take all the gems and put them through a real dependency resolution system that returns a list of all the requirements, so that you can't have that bug of could not activate this gem, already activated this other version. That can't happen anymore because we're doing all the gems together. So either it'll work and we'll get a valid configuration, or we'll be able to tell you there was a conflict between these things, and you'll be agreeing that there's actually a conflict between those things. There's also the feature of require as, so you can say, like Sinatra is required as Sinatra, so that's fine, but gchart RB is required as Google Charts, so you can say that. You can also specify environments, and this basically means these gems are only required in this environment. Bundler has its own notion of environment because it's not Rails specific, but when you use it with Rails, it maps directly onto the Rails environment. So if you use it with Rails and say that you want something in a test environment, it will be required and activated only in the test environment of Rails. But again, you can use it just fine outside of Rails, and then you can use whatever environment names you want. And you can also specify a bunch of things like only for staging and production, these things. You can also say except development test or except test. The way that this basically works is that you specify your list of dependencies in a file called gem file. You run gem bundle. Once you run gem bundle, it goes and downloads all the dependencies, installs them in your application. You can run git push. When you git push, you can git ignore whatever you want from it. So you can git ignore the expanded gems, or you could git ignore, or you could push the expanded gems, or you could git ignore all the downloaded gems. But you can basically include whatever you want from your repository. And then when you git clone again and run gem bundle again, it just works. And basically what that means is that you're guaranteed that if I give you a repo and you run gem bundle on it, it will continue to work as long as you've checked in at the least the .gem file. So you check in all the .gem files that we determine that you need, and I pull it down, and when I run gem bundle again, it just expands those out. It installs any binary dependencies that you might need. And then you can be assured that the system is not going to be messing with things. There's an option of disable system gems, which we recommend, and that basically means like no matter what, under any circumstances, do not pull in system gems. And that means that if I have it working on my machine with disable system gems and I give it to you, it will definitely work. There cannot be a case where I have something installed on my system and that's why it's working. In Rails, there will be a script bundle, and that's basically just a wrapper around it. You'll be able to use gem bundle, but script bundle will probably do some Rails-specific things, and we're going to encourage people to do that in Rails. Again, the nice thing is it works with compile gems, so you're just checking in the .gem file, which has the C source, and when you deploy it on the remote system or on gem bundle there, it'll pull down the compile gems and install it as C. But if you have binary gems or you have JRuby, that works fine too. So if you're deploying onto Windows for some crazy reason, and you have the Windows version of your gem, that'll work fine as well. It's also idempotent, like I said, which means that you can run it multiple times, and after the first time, it knows, oh, I've already actually resolved all these dependencies and they match, so I'm not going to do it again. And then you can git ignore the fully expanded version and run it again, and so it knows, oh, I've already downloaded all the gems, but I haven't expanded them yet, so it expands them. Essentially means that you can be clever about what you're ignoring and what you're not ignoring, and we are clever about expanding the right things and downloading new things if necessary. It also works today. It's being used on real projects. It's being used on Engineer Cloud. It's being used for Rails itself. It's being used for Gemcutter. It's being used at 37 signals. So it's actually working already today, which is cool. And it's getting real use and getting real bugs, a lot of them, and we're fixing them. So it's good. Second huge feature is the router. The router came basically from a lot of merb ideas, a lot of which Carl worked on, a lot of which people worked on because they were frustrated with the Rails router and they saw merb's router as a good way to sort of reboot the concepts. And the router is backwards compatible with Rails 2.3, so it means if you have a Rails 2.3 router, it'll continue to work. And you can add new routes alongside the Rails 2.3 routes without any problem. So if you do map.connect, that's fine, and there's a new Rails 3 API that also works fine right alongside it. The first simple thing is just blocks are now a first-class concept, so there's no more with options. There's just, if you say controller sessions, that's the same thing as putting it anywhere nested, no matter how deep you get. And that work goes for anything that you could use as an option. So everything that could be an option is now a first-class method that will take a block, and you can nest them however you want. It just works. So that was a suck before, and it's just fixed. A controller and action pairs are shortened as OpenID hash login. So that's controller OpenID action login, and that's just because that's a really common idiom, and it was frustrating to have to type in controller OpenID action login all the time. Constraints, there are a couple in Rails 2.3. There's requirements and something else, I think, that you can use. They're all combined into one concept called constraints. You can still use the same constraints that you were able to use before, like providing a regular expression match on a path segment. But you can also do other constraints on anything on the request object. So in this case, you're constraining your IP to anything that's in 192.168.1 and then 3 numbers. And that works fine. You can see we're using the queen bee hash index syntax here. And you can also, like I said before, you can move the constraints up into a block. So you can say all these things inside of here are constrained to be in this IP, or something that matches this IP. You can also make any constraint an object. So in this case, we're making the IP restrictor class an object. It responds to matches question mark, takes the request, and you just have to return a Boolean, yes or no, to whether it matches. So you can do arbitrarily complex stuff in there and test that stuff no matter what you're doing, as long as it has something to do with the request, which is cool. You can also match to any arbitrary rack application. So this would be a Sinatra application or any rack application that you made yourself. It's just a first-class concept. You can just say match this URL to this back-end application, which is nice. Also, there's a status code. I don't remember what it is. I think we may have used 418, which is the I'm a teapot status code, because we thought nobody would actually use it. Also, we thought we were building a coffee machine. But I don't know what the status code is. There's a status code you can actually return from your application that means continue on in the router. So the router, once it gets an endpoint that matches, it will dispatch it. But if it gets back some status code that I don't remember, it will go on and continue trying to match. So that gives you more power in the endpoint rack applications that you're building. Because 2 takes any arbitrary rack application, we can do cleverer things than we were able to trivially do before. So you can do match account/login to redirect login, and that is implemented this way. So there's a lambda in there that's taking environment, and it's returning the status, the location, content type, and move permanently. And so it's a very, very, very simple rack application that just returns a redirect. Before I said that the 2 takes any arbitrary rack application, so you might be thinking like, oh, this is a string. That's not a rack application. How does that work? And the answer is it actually expands to this, which is another point, which is that all Rails actions now are rack applications. So if you have instead of it being a controller thing, you dispatch into a controller, and then it's doing its own additional stuff. The router actually dispatches directly to actions, and if you don't use the router at all and just do queen bee controller.action index, you get back an object that you can do call on with a rack environment, and it will return back a rack response, which radically simplifies testing. So you can actually get an action and test it, and it will do the right thing. Resources are also simplified, so instead of having to do that really, really long one-liner that has like everything about the resource in it, you can do a block. And you can do things like this is a get or a post. You can say something's on a collection or on a member, and you can do that as many times as you want. And you can nest further. So basically, we've looked at what the things that were painful about doing resources were, and we've made block syntax for it. One last thing. So this is actually what the controller action ID format block looks like internally in Rails 2.3. So you can leave out action or ID or format, and that works. And so like the parentheses are optional segments, and that actually works in Rails 3 for anything. So there's no more like we have magically decided that action is an optional segment or ID is an optional segment, mainly because the router, like the bundler, is a separate library that you can use on your own. It's just a rack library, and so it doesn't make sense for us to decide that the word action is magic. So we've just exposed the ability to have optional segments wherever you want, however you want. And as an example of this being useful immediately is locales. There's a plugin, a filter plugin that lets you define locales as a totally separate concept as like using some magic filtering plugin thing. And in Rails 3, you can just put locale in parentheses up front and then mark it as a default of English, and you're done. And I suspect that probably 90+% of all plugins that have to do with the router will be eliminated entirely as a result of all these new features, and the remaining ones will go from being like 150 lines to 2, or maybe 5, right? Some small amount of lines. Another feature, respond with. This comes directly from merb. Basically, if you're dealing with things that are basically scaffold API type controllers, so this doesn't work so well if you have really complex, like most of your stuff is HTML controllers doing really complex stuff. But if you're doing a lot of API stuff, being able to say this controller responds to these JSON and XML, and then in your index you just say like, my posts are post.findAll, and respond with that, and it will say like, oh, are you trying to do HTML? If so, return the HTML template. If you're trying to do JSON, call to JSON. And it'll also automatically, unlike merb, which was somewhat limited, it'll also do stuff like if you're in a create action and you're in HTML, it'll know to redirect back to index. The really cool thing about this responder thing is that it's actually an object that we have just provided a default one of, so you can inherit from that, provide mixins for that, get a plugin for it, make your own. And it has an API that you could use. So probably most people will just, if they use this at all, use the default one. But you can totally write a plugin that has special behavior. So all those resourceful plugins that do a lot of hacking can be implemented as respond with. So it's just a respond with plugin that does the right thing. So Racification is the next big chunk. The way Rails 2.3 worked in terms of rack, it had rack support, but it went from the router to the controller and then stopped there. And the thing that wasn't great about that is that if you actually look in the controller, you can see that there's the recognize method actually goes and it calls params controller.2s.camelize controller.constantize. So it calls into the controller. But then the controller sets the action name equals to params action or index. So params action inside the controller is just a special thing. And then there's a bunch of code that says, what do I do? If there's an action methods includes the action name, then do that. Otherwise, default render unless performed. So there's a bunch of work that happens now that's completely outside the purview of rack because you sent in a magical name called action. As I said earlier, in Rails 3, the router dispatches directly to an action, which means that there isn't any more work that gets done to figure out what to do. So the call here in the route set does controller.action, params action.call environment. So now the router wrapper is responsible for knowing, you're trying to go to an action, params action is special because it's the Rails router wrapper, right? And it actually does a call env into that object. And like I said before, postcontroller.action index is a rack object, which is fine. The big win here is that you can now do this. So you can use any arbitrary middleware inside of a controller, and that middleware, it basically works like a filter, except you can use somebody else's middleware that they wrote for rack. And you can also limit it to particular actions using only an except like you would for a filter. And essentially, this does not provide any additional functionality over before, after, and around filters, but it provides the ability to reuse components that other people have written for rack. And it's maybe I think the whole thing to add use my middleware is like 5 lines of code because of the fact that we've re-implemented this in terms of rack. So it's all rack. Also middleware, if you want to use parts of the controller flow inside of middleware, so like you want to have rendering, you can inherit from action controller middleware and then pull in whatever module. So you may have been thinking before, like, what's the benefit of this whole module system if you just give me action controller base and I use that? And that's true, most people will do that. But it now provides the ability for us to create a class like action controller middleware, and you just pull in the modules that you need, and you get that functionality. So because you've included helpers and rendering, you get the helper module method, so you can say InViews as a helper, and then the call method is just the same as regular middleware, and you can set instance variables and call render some template. It will render it and pass the instance variable through. And because you didn't include layouts here, you don't get layouts, so you don't have to pay for the overhead. So you can write middleware that's just the reason that you're writing middleware. It's just as tight and fast as regular middleware, except for the parts where you care and you're willing to pay the additional cost of templates, for instance. So you can pull in whatever features you want. And again, the reason why this works is that we've re-architected the whole thing so that there isn't really special notions of controllers really anymore, and these modules have very limited concerns, what they care about. The last piece, which is what Carl and I have been working on for the past couple of weeks, is that applications in Rails are no longer just the set of things that exist in the global state. So in Rails 2.3, an application is it's just your process, basically. Rails 3 adds the idea of an application object. So instead of saying Rails initializer.run do config, and then you set your stuff in there, you say class. It's going to be class Mephisto : application inherits from Rails application. You do your configuration in there, and then in config.ru, you just say run Mephisto would be : application. And now you have an object that actually responds to call. It's valid. And has things like configuration on it, but it also has like its own root. And long term, the meaning of this is that you can actually have multiple processes, multiple applications in one process. And because the router points at arbitrary rack applications, you can take another application, which is a rack application, and mount it in the router. So the whole idea of mountable apps, while it requires definitely some more work to really get rid of all the global state, it's just an outgrowth of the way we're architected now, right? The fact that Rails applications are application objects that respond to call. The router just routes to arbitrary rack applications. All this means that we can just do things that were just not possible before. And it doesn't require big new function pushes. It doesn't require us really thinking through these brand new problem sets. It just requires us making things more sane and conceptually correct. And then all these new features come out of it without us having to do all this work, which is nice. So that's sort of the list of how we did. I think a lot of this was considered vaporware a year ago. I know DHH's talk at RailsConf literally had many pictures of unicorns in it. And I think that's how a lot of people felt about it. And it took a while, for sure, but I feel like we've made significant, huge progress in terms of what we said we were going to do. And I feel good about it. So I guess I'll take any questions if people have any. I know that was very fast, but I hope you can handle it. Yes, sir.
I may have to hug you later.
Mike. If that's all, then you don't need the mic.
Yeah. Better not be on the air.
Anybody else?
When?
When?
More like how far along are you?
So there are already people that are playing with what's on Edge. Rails has historically been Edge playable, but we definitely made some pretty big changes that change just the process of getting set up on Edge. So it's easy once you get set up on Edge to be developing on Edge, but the setup process is kind of difficult, and that's what we're working on right now. So right now, the remaining pieces before we can release something are just make all the rake tasks work. So like bunches of rake tasks don't work anymore because there's an application object now, and you can't just grab global things and run them. So it's easy-ish. But we have to just go through everything, all the user-facing stuff, and make it work again. Once that's done, there will be a release designed for really early adopters and plugin developers. People will tell us whether we essentially broke the public API or not. If we didn't, and we can get plugins working pretty quickly, then we'll release soon. It may turn out that there's a lot of bugs that we didn't anticipate, or plugin porting turns out to be harder than expected. But once we've actually released something soon, once the rake tasks are working again and the downloading gem install works, it'll be pretty obvious how far along we are, right? It'll be based on how many bugs are left. So if there's a lot of bugs still, the best way to make it come faster is if you have a plugin or an application that hacks into Rails, get it and see what the porting looks like. You should totally expect to have to do porting. You should expect that any internal hack that you were doing before doesn't work anymore, but you should also expect that there's a new sanctioned way to do it. So if you have to take one hack and replace it with another hack, then we're missing something. You should be replacing it with a real thing. So that's sort of the plan, is to release something and let you tell us how far along we are. Any other questions?
Is there like a running documentation or stream of changes or something like that you could look at now to see what you need to change to port?
Not yet, and that's one of the things we need to do. So there's some pieces of documentation on the wiki that I started doing a while ago, which has like what the active model API looks like. But there needs to be significantly more, and I think we're probably going to err on the side of releasing and letting the early adopters help us with that rather than make everybody wait until we've written all the documentation, because that just isn't probably going to work. So so there's really probably two phases. There's the phase where the really early adopters come help us out and make it safe for the early adopters. But so a thing that I didn't say that I should have is there's the book Agile Web Development with Rails that is actually pretty comprehensive about Rails. And one of the authors of that book, Sam Ruby, has a test suite that essentially tests every single thing in the book, including like the output of this command. And it does it by actually running the command and then capturing the output and putting it in a big XML file and then having another thing that processes that and checks to see if the output is correct. I don't know if I would have done it that way, but it works. And for the most part, probably 98% of the way, we have made his tests have continued to pass. There are a few cases where we've purposely changed things that are in the book, but they're few and far between. And even things mostly including the output have continued to work. So if you use the Rails 2.3 book as a Rails 3 getting started guide with a few specific exceptions, which he's going to document, things will continue to work. So I think there's really a difference between the public-facing API, how people expect to use Rails. I think that's actually really, really stable and solid because it's literally like generating a new app, running script server, running script generate, checking to make sure that if you change the router, it's still, like all this stuff is being tested. But if you do something that requires looking into the Rails API, which almost everybody does, that stuff, it's unclear to me if that's really stable, like I hope it is, or still needs a lot more work. and it's hard to tell. The 37 Signals guys, Brian Helmkamp from now the Guilt Group, previously We Play, Carl and I have been building apps on this stuff for a while. It's working for us, but it's hard for us to know if it's stable or not. Okay.
One of the things that I read about as far as Rails 3 coming out was it was the marriage of Rails and merb. But something I didn't really get from your talk was, so what does merb bring to Rails for people that don't know merb? I mean, what goodness does it bring? And I was expecting to kind of hear a little more of that. I'm just
So
curious.
another way to title this talk would be the merge of Rails and merb. So everything I talked about was something that merb did that we brought to Rails. What we didn't do was take actual merb code. What we did do often is rewrite something in Rails or radically re-architect something to take advantage of conceptual things from merb. Something to realize is that Carl and I are a year older, and not everything that we did in merb is exactly how we would have done it in Rails. So there's a lot. Basically, the thing that we brought to Rails is staff. So Carl and I are both working on Rails full time now, and concepts. And it's everything from the router, which is pretty much a feature set directly taken from merb, to the bundler, which is an improved version of something we tried to do in merb, and to just the architecture being conceptually correct. And I would say that Rails 3 is, especially in terms of rack, significantly better than what we had in merb. Rails 3 really, there isn't really a part of Rails 3 anymore that should be a rackify that isn't. Whereas merb 1.1 or 1.013 or whatever you can download today still has big chunks of it that could use a rack makeover. And that probably will happen by the guys who are maintaining merb now. But yeah, it's pretty much just the guys who were working on merb spent a year working on Rails, and that's what it is now.
Well, we appreciate your work on it.
Thank you.
This is not a hugging question. So Rake is good. Thor is better. Is it going to be agnostic in terms of that?
So Thor is bundled with Rails now, but it does not replace the existing rake tasks. It replaces the generators. So Thor, I wrote Thor. It's awesome. I like it. Jose Valine, who worked on the generators for Google Summer of Code, added a bunch of features to the Thor that makes it suitable as a generator framework. So Thor is now Rake, Saki, and RubyGen. And with that version, which is very rapidly approaching 1.0, we'll probably release 1.0 of Thor when we release Rails 3 around the same time. So the current Thor, which is like 0.13.5, is really good and is bundled with Rails, and there's no reason why we can't take existing binaries in Rails and replace them with Thor. So things like script server could easily be Thorified. In terms of actual commands like db migrate, I think that's something that could happen later, and it may happen as an alternative sooner rather than later, but that hasn't been a focus. So we like it, especially the fact that it can handle command line variables and you don't have to do like Rails env equals blah rake db migrate. That's a big win for us. And so it has gotten into Rails, but probably the question that you meant to ask, which is like, does it replace rake db migrate? Not yet. And I don't know if ever, but I hope so.
Okay. And I noticed you didn't do anything on Active Record. Are you guys staying away from that because there's Data Mapper that you've worked on before?
So Active Record actually has undergone a pretty initial change that is exciting to me. Active Relation, which is relation algebra engine, has been moved inside of it, but it hasn't fully been integrated yet. So it's been integrated enough to ship it, and it will work, and it adds a bunch of cool features like laziness. So you can do like post.all, and then it will return a lazy thing instead of actually querying the database. So there's stuff like that already works today. And it passes all the old Active Record tests. But there's still a lot of work to be done, and it's not work that Carl and I are particularly interested in. Carl's actually very interested in ORMs, but not Active Record. I think because both of us have worked on it a lot in previous jobs. So that's a part of it that's actually very hard to fix, and we both think that there are good alternatives that continue to get better. So we don't work on Active Record except when something we do in other parts of Rails break Active Record, and we make sure it works. Like our new callbacks got integrated into Active Record. So yeah, I really hope that Active Record gets a lot better pretty soon. I think that's more possible than I thought it was a year ago. There was a Google Summer of Code project to integrate Arrow, and that was a pretty massive step. It's equivalent in my mind to the Google Summer of Code project the year before to get Rack in, right? So initially it wasn't that big of a deal, but now it was in, and now like people who cared could make it awesome.
Well, it sounds like if it's easy to bring in Data Mapper, then a lot of people will be like, hey, Active Record isn't so great.
Right, so that's true, right? You could bring in Data Mapper, and I hope that at the very least what it does is put pressure on us to make Active Record more awesome. But even if all it does is say that there's an actual alternative that works, that's fine too. There's no part of Rails other than Active Record now that cares about Active Record. So it all works, it's all really integrated, but because of the fact that you can integrate with any ORM, Active Record just happens to be the first one, right?
You should also mention that Carl is working on his own ORM.
I don't know if that's public information. Yeah, actually it is. No, so Carl's doing something interesting, which is he's working on a mathematically pure ORM that is more about like being able to analyze the relations in memory before you actually make database queries. So it's like a Ruby query optimizing ORM that would have all the features of Data Mapper in it, and it would be really cool when it's done, but it's hard. So it might, like, I would keep an eye on it, I guess. But right now, I think right now it does SQL, but every single relation gets the entire table because he's specifically doing the thing where you start by completely not optimizing it, and then you add optimization features that are generic. So instead of saying, like, I'm going to add features where I'm going to tell SQL how to do joins, he's adding a feature where any backend could say, I know how to do a join, right? And then SQL will just get that once it's able to say that, and it will be free. So it's going to be a longer, harder slog and start out less interesting than I think people will expect. But it may end up being like really powerful because it'll mean that there's optimizations that you can do in the Ruby side before ever doing queries that are otherwise impossible. Like it can actually analyze the entire graph that you're looking at and make a query for the whole thing easily. So that could be cool. And it could be optimized further.
Are there any changes that improve any of the deployment?
Deployment. So deployment isn't actually part of Rails. There's Capistrano, obviously, but so I would say that deployment is something that's being worked on by deployment companies like Heroku and EngineYard. A side effect of the fact that there are deployment companies is that we work with them. So Rails gets better conceptually. Like the bundler is very much targeted at being able to be used by deployment people. We're working with Heroku to get them to be able to support bundler. EngineYard already does, right? So there are things that Rails does and Rails integrates with that are useful for deployment. But then there are these whole other concepts like when I deploy, I need to make sure my memcache server gets purged or something like that. That isn't really a Rails concept. And I think my personal opinion, I don't want to speak for anybody else on the core team, is that Capistrano is kind of a bridge between where we are now and where we're going, where we have something like Chef and actual deployment systems that are smart. I think that Capistrano, the concept of like SSHing into all your machines and giving them commands over SSH was a nice bridge and worked really well and was better than like the PHP version where you FTP your files in. But long term, I think there's better things coming, and people should look at Chef in particular. It's cool. Anybody else? There seems to be one up here.
So early on, you talked about merb trying to solve the long files going into the system and stuff like that. What's the Rails 3.0 answer?
There's an Nginx module that does file uploads. You should use that. Okay. But Rails has been thread safe for a while. We just did some work over the past week to fix. So Rails 2.3's thread safety mode relies on us having correctly guessed what files need to be eagerly loaded, and that was just not sane. So Rails 3 automatically eager loads all files that are put under autoload. So there's an autoload system in Ruby that we extend in Rails to collect the information about what's been put under autoload, and when you go into thread safe mode, we require everything. And there's been some talk about making it so that you can't require files in thread safe mode at all after Rails boots, because the problem that happens is that you require a file in one thread, it gets half required, the constant gets defined, but there's some methods that are at the end of the file, and then there's a context switch that goes on to the next, another thread, which uses the constant. The file is there for, the file doesn't get re-required because it's already, the constant's already loaded in memory, and then it tries to use a method that hasn't been parsed and loaded yet. That's a little, what I just said is a little messy, but it suffices to say that require is not possible to make thread safe in Ruby. So, especially on JRuby where things are happening simultaneously for real, it's a huge issue. In MRI, it's not usually an issue because most files can be parsed and executed in under 20 milliseconds, which is their boundary, or 10. But in JRuby, there's actually threads doing things in parallel. And so you easily have, I'm in the middle of parsing this file, and some other thread tries to go access the constant and the methods. So we've improved the thread safety story. And so there are other cases where you can't use an Nginx module, where merb was really good, that Rails 3 should be fine at. Rails 2.3 was basically fine at it if you did the work to make sure that thread safetyness was correct. Some people figured out some additional files they would want to require and things like that. So, did that make sense?
Close enough.
The answer is it should just work. Like the things that we made merb for should be things that Rails can handle natively now. Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for having me.